Well, it's a real honor to be here tonight, and thank you, Ellen, wherever you are, for getting in touch with me. And, oh, Ellen, that's a sorry about that. Anyway, before I get going here, let me see if I can do this right. Yep. This year, 50 years ago, I should say, this past August, I began my work, professional work at the Maine State Museum, which was a wonderful time for me. I mean, it was like playing in the sandbox all day long, you know. I I worked with some wonderful people. My mentor, Fred Shearer, was a background painter and a preparator at the American Museum of Natural History. He was there for 38 and a half years. Started out with one of the most famous dioramas in the world, and that is the mountain gorilla group in the Akeley Hall. So anyway, I want you to tell you a little bit about myself. My history goes back a lot farther than 1973 when I started work at the museum. This photograph was taken in 1960. The man on the left is Governor John Reed. The man in the middle is Claire Beck, who had taken things out of storage from old storage barns of the state to form a museum, a new museum, at the lower floor of the State House. Claire did 4 dioramas, and he asked this young fellow if he'd like to do a couple turtle sculptures for one of the exhibits. And this young fellow was me. And that this is a ceremony we had in the museum at the time. I was 15 years old. I still do turtle sculptures. I just can't get away from turtles. This one went across the country, spent some time in Colorado, Washington State, and a few other areas. There's another one that was an exhibit in upstate New York that I did more recently, a male wood turtle in breeding color. And I've done a few museum exhibits. This one happens to be a sapling of an extinct tree on its fossil bed. And that was done for the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History. I also still do paintings too. This 2-foot by 4-foot painting, as you probably can guess if you've ever been to Acadia National Park, straight down is Sand Beach. I almost called it Fine Sand Beach, which is on Swans Island, where I live now. And as you can see, the mountains on the left, those are the hills that Jeannie and I used to like to hike. So I'm also an author, as you know now. I did the book Mystery Tusk, and fortunately I had some help with the writing of it from my next door neighbor, who happens to be a wonderful poet, and he also teaches creative writing in online for a college in New York State. So back in 1989, I was just finishing up this exhibit of Native American edible plants. And so I had to collect these plants. I had to do casts, molds, color notes, do waxwork, cotton wire, you name it, and creating this exhibit. And it, like I say, it took me about 2 years to do this. So in the process of finishing this exhibit, Bruce Bork, who was the chief archaeologist at the museum at the time, and also the head of the exhibit hall that I was working in, asked me if I could do an introductory case that would draw people into the exhibit hall. And Bruce wanted some fossils, and he wanted a particular fossil from a particular time period. Here is, let me say, this is, this painting is, if you've ever gone to Acadia National Park, you probably recognize this as the hills known as the Bubbles and Jordan Pond. And you can see this ice sheet behind it. Now, that ice sheet at one time was a mile to possibly a mile and a half thick. And if you can think of ice that thick, you know, that's got to weigh an awful lot. In fact, it caused the Earth's crust to sag. And as it did so, the right rebound of that crust took longer than the ice melt when the glacier started melting back. And so here we see the glacier as it's not retreating, but it's melting back. In other words, the glacier is still moving toward the ocean, and it's pulling along rocks that are grinding against bedrock and causing all sorts of mud and various types of geological material. And this is a late glacial period. So what Bruce wanted was fossils from this time on. And that meant a lot of things like searching for seal flippers. And that's the bones in the flippers. That's the only thing that's existing. And also, I knew of some walrus skulls. They were already being donated to the museum from other institutions. So I wanted to get a little more information from some people that could help me out. One of those people was Dr. Woodrow Thompson at the Maine Geological Survey. And so Woody had helped me out a lot in getting gem quality museum specimens in the past from the Western Hills of Maine. And we got some transferred from Harvard University too. So I said, Woody, do you know anything about fossils that from the Ice Age that might interest me? And Woody started listing off a bunch of these fossils, which I knew were already being assigned to the Maine State Museum. And then he mentioned this one. He said, that's at Hal Bourne's office up at the University of Maine and the Institute of Quaternary Studies, which is now known as the Climate Change Institute. So people understand that a little better. So I went up to see Hal, and I was talking to him about the tusk, and he said, well, he said, it might have come from Scarborough, Maine. I said, Scarborough, Maine, geez, a tusk like that. I mean, here's a 10, 12-foot long tusk. And I said, geez, you mind if I photograph that and maybe take it back and look it over and see if we can figure out, where it came from? He said, here's the problem. He said, the old Portland Museum of Natural History, which disbanded in 1970, had these crates, and one of the crates said Tusk, and it got moved up to the University of Maine Presque Isle. So he said, I was up there and I was looking over that collection, and I opened up the crate. The crate had two tusks in it. One was labeled Alaska. The other was labeled, Scarborough, Maine. He said, the problem is the labels fell off the tusks. Which one's from Scarborough? Well, Hal and I started talking about, well, when do you think this thing was dug up? And we both thought, okay, probably 1800s, because as far as we know, nobody's heard of any tusk being dug up. And so we talked with Herb Adams. Now, Herb was at that time, Herb worked in the legislature for a while, but at that time, Herb was also a reporter for the Portland Evening Express. And they were starting to merge with the Portland Press Herald. And Herb said, well, I can look through my records and see if I can find anything. Sure enough, a week later, he came up, two guys digging up a tusk. They were digging a farm pond in North Scarborough and came across this tusk. So now I had not only a photograph of who dug it up, but I also had names. I went down to the microfilm in the state library, and I found a Portland Press Herald article on this. So I ended up with two names, Leonard Cash and James Littlejohn. Now, I checked the phone book in the Greater Portland directory, and I found the name Littlejohn, but I did not find James. But I did find William J. Littlejohn, and I thought, sounds like a close relative to me. So, I'll read you a little bit of foreword of my book. Hello, this is Gary Hoyle, I said into the telephone. I'm the curator of natural history at the Maine State Museum. I don't know if I have the right Littlejohn. Is it about the tusk? Janice Littlejohn replied. Hit pay dirt. So I went to see the Littlejohns. And Bob Lewis, who was the assistant archaeologist at the time at the State Museum, came with me. We found out that the tusk from Orono was not the tusk that really came from Scarborough. So when Mr. Littlejohn looked at my photograph, he said, that's not the one we dug up. And so he showed me photographs of the tusk. Eventually, we acquired the tusk. I also took some bone chips, what am I saying? Ivory chips from the tusk, and I sent those off for carbon dating, radiocarbon dating. But Miss Littlejohn said, now, this is what we found around the tusk. That little clam right there, okay, it's known as Portlandia arctica. And as Bob Lewis said, turning to me, he says, that's post-glacial. So that means that we've got an ancient tusk. We can't prove it at this time because we don't have radiocarbon dating yet. But good chance that we're dealing with something prehistoric. And that prehistoric tusk had to have come from two different creatures. This one here, which kind of looks like a slouched elephant that's kind of shaggy, is known as a mastodon. It was a browser, kind of like a moose and deer. Its tooth shape was like this, kind of like a moose and deer, except these are more breast-shaped, these cusps, which it gives the mastodon its name, mastectomy, and tooth odont, so mastodon. Or it could be this creature here, which is the famous symbol of the Ice Age, really, the woolly mammoth. So we thought, okay, none of us knows what the heck, we didn't know much about tusks, so we got to get a specialist in here. So we hired Dan Fisher from the University of Michigan, who had been working on tusks for a long time. And Dan looked over our tusk, and he said, the cupped end It's pretty shallow. He says it's too shallow for a male. The curvature looks like I'm about 60% certain it's a mammoth. So somebody said, well, we know it's a female, so let's call her Harriet. And I said, well, wait a minute. We got two hairy elephants. Why don't we call it Harry It? And so that's the name we used. Now, I didn't have any experience doing any kind of excavating for fossil specimens. And I didn't know of anybody else that really did either at that time. So I signed up for a dinosaur dig. Jack Horner was doing a dinosaur dig out in eastern Montana in the Badlands out there. And so I signed on to his dig. Now, he was pretty much unknown to the public until the Jurassic Park movies came out, and he was the science advisor on those movies. So we worked like a survey party, and we'd go along these shallow banks on these small buttes, and I would have some people down below me, people above me, and we would walk slowly along the banks until somebody saw a bone and they'd holler bone, and we'd all stop. The site director would then come up, examine the bone, and then see if she could find the fossil bed from which that was draining out. We found such things as this jawbone, for instance, of a hadrosaur, which is a plant-eating dinosaur. And so I sketched that out. There was also a lot of wildlife. Surprisingly, how much wildlife is in the Badlands. It's quite amazing. And so while our site director was giving a 20-minute talk, this little fellow got up on my index finger and sat there through the talk. So when I got home back to Maine, we decided, okay, we're going to start digging here pretty soon. So we got hooked up with the Maine National Guard, the engineer battalion, and so they worked with us that about a month and a half later. And here, fellow Phil Caesar, actually, his name, he's cutting a wall just above the farm pond that Mr. Littlejohn had led us to show us where they dug up the Tusk. And if you look down a little bit on the foreground, and maybe I should. This is the pond mud down below here. This is the device that pumped the pond out. So he's just above the pond there. He's working his way across, and it got to be a little dangerous to be working there. So he had to. You can see there's a big pile of earth over by the trees, and that pile of earth had come up from the original dig when they dug the pond in 1959. So he said, "Well, I'll just move that to the other side of the pond so that we can continue our dig for the stratigraphy." In so doing, he did that the following morning, and in so doing, pieces of bone started tumbling out of the machine. So everybody just went frantic, bone, we found bone. So we began to gather this bone, and in the process, we changed our trajectory. No longer were we going to dig into that pond. We were going to spend our time sifting through this pile of earth that had come up in the original dig. So we did that. And on the second day, we came up with this. It's not a mastodon tooth. Notice that the biting surface looks more like a millstone, and that's exactly how it was used, because this is the tooth, a 7.5-pound tooth of a woolly mammoth. And that creature as I said, that was a female, and we found out later that she actually died in the winter, and so she looked probably something like this in a winter coat. So we went through this pile of earth. We spent the whole of that, well, remainder of that year working on this pile of earth. So the next year we thought, okay, now we're going to go into the pond. So the first thing we did is we drained the pond, and then we got diggers to start digging out the muck on the bottom of the pond. And sure enough, one of our people fell into the muck, and Judy Ritchie. And Judy was pulled out of the muck. We pulled her out of the muck, and the first thing she said, "I swam with Harriet." So it was time to bring in the heavy equipment. And fortunately, we got it in there. They stepped back so that we were safely working in the area. They stepped the soil profile back. And you can see us down below here, me and several other people working in the lower reaches of the clay, and we're pushing probes into the clay to see if we can make contact with any kind of bone or artifact that's in there. Sometime later, I did a sketch of the site because I thought it would be a better way of clarifying it. The area that's labeled A is the remainder of the soil that was dug up in 1959. B is various layers of sand, a clump of sediment in C, and then down below is the marine clay where the tusk was actually found. And the upper region of that marine clay is kind of a brownish color. And that brownish color is due to organic acids working their way through the soil and staining the upper layer of the clay. Interestingly, when we were doing this dig, toward the end of it, we actually found depressions that were moles of things. And we determined that those moles were actually some kind of shell, maybe very likely a mussel shell that had dissolved away. So we knew that the tusk had been found lower in the clay, which means that the tusk was not found at a time when people were moving into the state. For instance, people were moving in from the coast. They were coming across by land, following the herds. And of course, some of them were very likely big game hunters too. In this case, we've got a person with an atlatl that's getting ready to shoot it at this big hairy elephant, which is a Columbian mammoth, which is the largest of the mammoths. And of course, at that time, trading was going on too. So very likely, ivory was being traded among the various tribes too. But just remember, this little guy had been found with a tusk. And the tusk had been found pretty deep in the clay. So here we have a shell that's associated with a marine environment. And we know by other information that this shell was most commonly found where meltwater was coming off the glaciers, the turbulence mixed in a brackish environment. So it looked like the tusk was deposited with a shell. How could that be? Well, we did another radiocarbon dating. This time we cut into the tusk, we cut into the molar tooth of the elephant, and we We sent it off to a lab for extra fine cleaning, whatever they do. But anyway, we finally found that, sure enough, the mammoth, Harriet, lived at a much earlier time period than we originally thought. And at that time, there was a massive ice sheet still over much of Maine. Uh, we we had open land, so there was enough prairie land for a mammoth. And in this case, looking at a short-faced bear, which would love to have a baby mammoth. And toward the end of the dig, we found one whole bone, the only whole bone that we found in that pile of earth that had been dug up in 1959. And when that bone was cleaned, we found a tooth mark on it. Now, we also found a mark on one of the ribs, and that was a barnacle shell shield mark. So we knew that this creature, at least part of this creature, had been in the salt water for quite a while. And we put all the science together, and this is what we came up with. Harriet died in late winter. When the spring came, the glacial melt increased, and of course, as a result, this body was propelled by a glacial river down to the coast. Once it reached the coast, it got swept out into the ocean. As it got swept into the ocean, a great white shark tore it to pieces. Part of that carcass floated into a bay with no more than 20 feet of water over it. The mud from that grinding that I told you about due to the glacier settled over the body. And the barnacle grew for just about, it's estimated about 2 months, and then died because it got smothered by the the overburden of the mud that was forming. Over time, the land began rebounding. Remember, I told you the weight of that glacier pushed the earth crust way down, and ocean water came in the state, in some cases up to 70 miles into the state. So anyway, the land began rebounding. As it rebounded, then other materials came in over the glacial mud, and eventually clay was formed. So this was the end of our story, we thought. Not everybody agreed with us. This elderly fellow came to me and he said, you know, I used to be a reporter at Portland Press Herald. He says, I went and I interviewed the geologists that were there when they dug up the Tusk originally. And they told me that they did radiocarbon dating and it proved to be modern. And I thought, how can that possibly be? He was convinced that this was not Harriet, but Old Bet. Now, Old Bet is famous. One of the reasons she's famous is she got shot and killed in Maine. She was the first African elephant to come into North America. She was originally owned by a wealthy ship captain who had her displayed around certain parts of the country. She came into Boston Harbor in 1804. The ship captain ran into problems, so he needed to sell the elephant. So he went naturally to a tavern to sell the elephant and sold it to a farmer, Hackaliah Bailey, who lived in Somers, New York. Hackaliah decided he was going to travel with the elephant by night to his farm. So Hecaliah traveled by night. There was a native that accompanied him back those days, you know. I mean, they purchased a native. So the native and the elephant were put up in the barn, and Hecaliah started selling tickets to see the elephant. So people would come in from all different directions to see something that they've never seen before. This African elephant, and there had only been one other elephant that was in the country at that time. So Hecaliah made quite a fortune, and he would travel by night with the elephant and go to a tavern. The next morning, they'd show the elephant in the stable or the barn hooked up to the tavern. Everybody get their beer going and have a great time. The tavern owners loved it, and Hecaliah made plenty of money selling tickets to see the elephant. Well, this worked out for a long, long time. And then in 1815, something happened on the other side of the world. A massive volcano erupted. It was known as Tambora. When it erupted, the superheated air above the Earth's rupture rose so quickly that a vacuum formed at the surface, drawing in a thunderous rush of air to fill the void. A violent whirlwind ensued, tearing up by the roots the largest of trees and carrying them into the air together with men, horses, cattle, and whatever else came into its influence. Just a few days after the April 10th eruption, the ash cloud spread to the size of Australia, chilling the tropical air in some places to temperate levels. 1 to 3 feet of ash dispersed over the western half of the island chain, not just the island, but the whole chain of islands. Then the famine began. From the direct blast to the end of Tambora's induced famine, upwards of 100,000 people died, and untold numbers of fish and wildlife. The eruption is considered the greatest volcanic event in the last 10,000 years. The mountain went from a height of roughly 14,000 feet to a little over 9,000 feet, ejecting 9.8 cubic miles of volcanic debris and leaving a crater 3.7 to 4.3 miles across and 2,000 to 2,300 feet deep. The ash cloud reached an estimated height of 144,000 feet, where the fine particles and sulfurous gases dispersed and affected climate worldwide for years, particularly in 1816. Anybody heard of 1816? It's an important date. The year there was no summer. Migratory birds flew into Maine. There was nothing there to feed on. No plant life. Everything was dead. No insect life. The birds began tumbling out of the sky. People started picking them up, taking them into their houses, warming them up, feeding them, and letting them go. They died. All of them died away. Wolves came into barnyards to get sheep. The bounty on wolves in 1816 in some locations was $40, a huge amount of money for 1816. People became so despondent that one fellow shot his cattle, every one of his cattle, and then hanged himself at the barn. One man in the western part of the state went out to get his sheep. He got lost in a snowstorm. I mean, this was like in May. Got lost in a snowstorm, and they didn't find him for 2 days. When they found him, his feet were frozen. He died within a few weeks of gangrene. The and this I was really fortunate. Hoyle, Maine, okay, you're a little sleepy town. Got this wonderful ornate library with newspapers for 1816, not microfilm, newspapers, actual newspapers. And I went to these newspapers and I could follow the path that was taken by this elephant that was being shown in Maine. I could also follow the weather each day, what happened. July 4th, exhibit in Hoyle, Maine. July 4th, the weather, snow. 2 days later, snow. Well, the elephant was shot and killed. Why? Because we get to Alfred, Maine, and this despondent farmer wanted to see the elephant. They let him in, but instead of buying a ginger biscuit to put in his pocket so the elephant could kind of rifle through it, and get the biscuit, he put in a wad of tobacco. The owner found out about that. This elephant had reacted badly to tobacco in the past. There's even an incident that happened in Portland, Maine, with the elephant. They threw the guy out because the elephant was drooling saliva and choking, and the owner thought, this guy's going to get killed by this elephant if I don't get him out of here. So they threw this fellow out of the display barn. That night, when they went to move the elephant, the fellow crouched down in the bushes, and as they went by, he shot the elephant with 2 balls in the back of the rib, and killed the elephant. But that's not the end story of that elephant. The owner of the elephant had it skinned immediately, and the meat, nobody knows where that meat went. But I got a feeling a lot of people fed on that meat in 1816 when life was pretty hard. The bones were cleaned, the hide was salted, and off went a wagon with bones and hide. Got to New York City, went to a tannery. They worked on the hide, went to a taxidermist who cleaned the bones. And the following year, this fellow by the name of, as I say, Hackleigh Bailey, this fellow right here, he showed the skeleton in one part of the city, but he showed the stuffed elephant somewhere else. So he was making money from the skeleton, and he was making money from the stuffed elephant. He also had the elephant insured for $30,000. 1816, $30,000, a lot of money. So he invested in a couple other elephants, and then as he got to be old, he started spending a lot of time in Bethel, Connecticut, which wasn't too far from Somers. And he began to frequent a store that was becoming very popular among people in the area. And they were telling stories and just cracking jokes and doing other things, and drinking beer and eating oysters. And he loved to tell a story about his times with old Bet, the elephant. The store owner was an 18-year-old kid, and he was enthralled with the stories that he was listening to. His name was Phineas Taylor Barnum. Eventually, Barnum, when he got into his 30s, he was fortunate to own the museum, which was called the American Museum, and the stuffed elephant was given to the American Museum by Bailey. Everything went well for Barnum. He made a lot of money at that museum. And then in 1865, all of a sudden, it all fell apart because a fire started in the lower area of the museum. It destroyed the entire museum along with the remains of Old Bet. And it was one of the worst fires in the city's history. Now, if you want to see where Old Bet died, all you got to do is go to Alfred, Maine, and you come out of Alfred on 202, heading south, and on your left, you'll see a boulder with a brass plate on it. And on that is the dedication to Old Bet and where she got shot. And if you want to know a lot more detail on a lot of stuff, buy the book. Thank you.